All right. All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome everybody to our October meeting. For anyone who doesn't know, my name is Erin Frigo. I am the president here of the Panhandle Archaeological Society, and our guest speaker tonight is Bradley C. Bailey with his presentation, The Use and Distribution of Elk Hide Lodges. At this time, we'll ask that you please mute yourselves. And if you're not sure how to do that, I can mute you as well. And just because this has happened once or twice before, if you do think that you're going to be like moving around a lot or something with your camera on, please turn your camera off because that can be a little distracting. With that, I give the floor to you, Brett.
All right, thank you. All right, so real quick introduction for me. Um, I'm based out of Denver, Colorado. Um, I've had those lifelong interests in Native American fur trade, Western history kind of culture. Um, my main focus is on material culture and the skills and processes, and especially like the intersection between Native cultures and European cultures pre-1850. I've never really been content with just reading about things, so I always have to go out and figure it out and learn to do things myself. And so that kind of led me to doing brain tanning, which I've done for about 20 years and done 300 to 500 hides, deer, antelope, elk, buffalo. And then tanning kind of led me into hide teepees, and that was one of the things I just always thought was the coolest and always really wanted to make. And so I started studying them real deeply, and that's kind of led me to where I am today. So here's just a couple quick pictures. Here on the left is me with a tanned cow elk hide, and then on the right is a picture of the elk hide lodge that I made. And so one of the first things that I usually hear about is like when you see this picture, it's the teepee so white that you wouldn't realize it was hide unless I told it to you, and you'd think it'd look like a canvas lodge because most people that are familiar with brain tanning kind of imagine them to be smoked and brown and tanned, kind of like the clothing in this picture. But that's intentional. And a lot of or pretty much all the hide teepees were sewn together with hides in their natural white state. And then once they were sewn and set up, then they were smoked. And references from the time periods demonstrate that, just like this quote here, where he talks about how they're sewed together without being smoked. But my favorite reference of kind of like the lifespan and the evolution of a hide lodge comes from Prince Maximilian, who came out west in the early 1830s and is often remembered as being the person who hired Karl Bodmer, the Swiss artist. But in his journal, he talks about how hide teepees only last a year and how initially they're nice and white, and then they later turn brownish and then black on top, and then finally kind of go back towards a rawhide state of parchment-like and transparent. And his description of how they only last a year is pretty common, but I would say anywhere from 1 to 3 years is the most common for the lifespan. But other references to the early 19th century also reiterate this and talk about how hide lodges are snowy white or white as linen. So that's just a little bit about that. I'm just going to give a little bit of background about hide teepees, and then I'll get into what I actually want to talk about, which is regarding the elk hide lodges. So this picture here on the left is one of two photos that I know of that show actually Native women sewing a hide lodge together. So these are some Cheyenne women after a successful buffalo hunt. And then this up here in the top right is kind of the classic pattern or typical pattern of a plain style teepee. And there's a number of different patterns and different tribal variations, but this is a fairly typical pattern with the 2 rows of hides. And then, patches being kind of sewn in where they come together. I wanted to touch base just a little bit on teepee sizes. So my focus is generally pre-1850. And whenever you look at the references from that time period, they're pretty consistently talking about hide teepees in the 10 to 12 foot range, sometimes a little bigger, 14, 15. But 10 to 12 is pretty much the average. And today we would think of that as being pretty small. The other thing is they don't always give that the measurements in feet like we use today. More often they talk about how many hides they take. So it's a 10 skin lodge or an 8 skin lodge. But I wanted to kind of just mention that a little bit. I don't usually talk about stone circles or teepee rings, but I remember I joined one of these meetings, maybe it was last year, and I saw a pretty interesting presentation about looking for stone circles or teepee rings on Google Earth. So I wanted to mention just a little bit about that. And I think you all probably know a lot more than I do. But the only reference that I've come across in all my years of looking for this stuff, uh, at least pre-1850, comes from Francis Parkman. And he talks about how he saw stone circles, and he says it's a trace of a Dakota winter encampment. Um, and it reminded me of a time where I took my hide teepee out to go camping in January in the mountains of Colorado. And the first time I tried to drive my stake in, I was like, yeah, that's not going to happen. The ground was just frozen solid. So I think that's probably a good explanation of maybe why. Or, if the ground is hard and rocky or, and then this on the right is just an illustration from Maximilian's journal, also showing either rocks, or he also talks about they would use chunks of sod. They would dig chunks of sod out of the ground and use that to hold the bottom of the teepee down. If you think about that kind of stuff, it's pretty easy to see why they probably didn't last that long with being on the ground and being wet. So I just wanted to mention a little bit about that. I would love if anybody has like really some good sources about stone circles, I'd love to hear, because I'm curious how well they line up with as far as sizes to what the early references match up to. But with that, I kind of want to get into my actual talk, and I have a little story to kind of start out with. But my goal to talk about is the use and distribution of elk hide teepees. And so the story on this is there's this thing called Cunningham's Law, which states that the best way to get the right answer on the internet isn't to actually ask the question, it's to post the wrong answer. Because as soon as you post the wrong answer, everybody's going to tell you you're wrong and give you the right answer. But I take that a step further and say, even if you're right on the internet, someone's going to tell you you're wrong. And so the reason I mention this is when I first made my teepee, I posted a picture. There's a Buffalo Hide Teepees group on Facebook, and I posted a picture of it there. And the very first comment I got from somebody was, "That's great, but you know that the Native Americans only used buffalo hides because buffalo hides are so much better." And I was like, well, darn, I wish you would have told me that before I started. Um, but I don't really fault them too much for saying that, because realistically, there's not a lot of information out there about hide teepees. So we have these two sources are the main ones out there. There's the kind of classic book by the Lawbins, The Indian Teepee, which is more about modern day canvas teepees. It was published in 1957. And then we have this book by Larry Baylitz that was published about 20 years ago about the buffalo hide teepee of the Sioux. And it's a pretty good book. Has a lot of good information about making them and a lot of great photos. But most people know stuff about teepees from the Lawbin book. And there's some important differences. Like when it comes to canvas teepees, you typically think of like when you pitch the cover, you set it off the ground, maybe like 5, 6 inches, and then you have a lining that goes around the inside, and that kind of gives you some airflow. Where that's not really the typical thing on hide teepees. Typically, the cover and hide teepees is pegged directly to the ground, or like in those pictures and using rocks, like the cover's on the ground and the rocks are holding it down. So that's one of the differences. And the other is the liners. The liners don't really show up that often early on. I've only come across two references before 1850, and they both state basically that only the best teepees had any kind of lining. And typically they were like cloth, whether they had like a number of yards of red Stroud wool or possibly sew 2 or 3 buffalo hides together, but it's not that full fitted liner like people think of. And then in the Lobbins book, they very they don't talk a lot about hide teepees, but what they do say is that in the early days, all teepees were made of buffalo hides. And so that's kind of the misconception that I want to address. And my goal is to cover not only show that elk hides were used, but kind of give a little bit of context and go into a little bit deeper and talk about, whether it's specific tribes or specific regions. Um, is there a reason that elk would be used over buffalo? Like, did elk only get used after the buffalo had been killed off, or was elk considered just sort of a second-rate poor material used as a substitute? So the first question is, well, who used them? And typically, if I ask a room of people who use them, someone will shout out Ute. And if we do dig into ethnographic accounts of the Ute, like Ann Smith's ethnography of the Northern Utes, it clearly states, teepees were made of elk hide more frequently than buffalo hide, usually required 10 hides to make a cover. And Densmore also talks about them using elk hide. And when we think of Utes and their range, they covered most of Colorado and half of Utah, but they did range out into New Mexico and the Texas Panhandle, but they're typically kind of thought of that Rocky Mountain tribe. And if we look into ethnographic accounts of other mountain tribes, we can look at James Teets, the Salishan tribes of the plateau, and the Flathead and the Pend Oreille. He talks about how they also have lodges made of buffalo and elk hide. And the Flathead and the Pend Oreille, or Pend Oreille is also known as the Kalispels, they're up in that northern or northwestern Montana, kind of east or west of the divide. So over here. And then just north of them is the Kootenai, who are in very north Montana and up into British Columbia. And the ethnographic accounts for the Kootenai talk about how the Kootenai preferred hunting elk for their hides and that they thought that the elk hides made better robes and teepee covers. So, this is clearly just going and looking at some ethnographic accounts. It's clear that yes, elk hides were used. Um, these are all examples of mountain tribes, and so that kind of brings up the question, you know, were elk hide teepees only ever used in the mountains? But one of the problems when we're looking at those ethnographic accounts is those are all written after the turn of the 20th century, so 19 teens and 20s, 30s, 40s. And so that's quite quite a couple generations after kind of hide lodges were common, and so the informants may have never even seen or made one. So I think going back further and digging into earlier references will kind of be a little bit more informative. So when we think of ethnographic type information, Henry Rowe Schoolcraft is kind of one of the first ethnographers of the Native Americans. And he originally was an Indian agent up in Michigan in the 1820s. And while he was there, he married a woman of Ojibwe descent. And he learned her language and he learned her family's culture and customs. And he wrote a lot about that. And then he was promoted up to superintendent of Indian Affairs. And then in 1846, Congress commissioned him to put together this major study of Native Americans. And it was 6 volumes and published in the 1850s. And he didn't know everything about every tribe. So what he did was he put together this questionnaire of hundreds and hundreds of questions asking all different aspects. And he sent that out to people. And one of the people that responded was a guy named Philander Prescott, who was a trader in Minnesota and Wisconsin in 1819 to 62. And he was married to a Dakota or Sioux woman. And so he responded to Schoolcraft's survey about the Dakota, and he talks about the lodges are 8 to 15 feet and made of buffalo skins but that elk skins are also used. And so that's in the 1850s or earlier, and that's the Sioux. Another reference in the 1850s comes from this newspaper, the Daily Minnesota Pioneer. So that's August 1854. And this article, it talks about a group of Sioux have just come into town and they were camped out at the Red Pipestone Quarry, which is in Minnesota. And they saw this terrific storm, the worst one they'd ever seen. And there was hailstones that were 1.5 times larger than goose eggs. And it talks about, if you can see my cursor, the new elkskin lodges occupied by the Indians were riddled to pieces. So it's a really fascinating account because one, it talks about, how the Hyde Lodge would have handled one of those terrible storms that happen fairly often on the plains, but also that it's elk hides. And so both of those are references amongst the Sioux. And the Sioux are kind of who we think of as like that classic nomadic plains buffalo hunting tribe. And their range is everywhere from Minnesota into the Dakotas and over into eastern Wyoming and Nebraska. And so that points that, it wasn't just specifically a trait of a Rocky Mountain tribes, but also the plains. And just kind of like a side note, um, I've been keeping track of these references for many years, and at least 25% of all the references I've found of elk-hide teepees are amongst the Sioux. Um, but if you were to look at any kind of ethnographic account that are specific to the Sioux, none of them will say anything about using elk hides, and neither does Larry Baylitz's book. So it's kind of an interesting thing just to keep in mind that um, ethnographic information isn't always complete, and sometimes it's missing some of the details. But if we go and look at some of the other tribes we think of as plains tribes, we have the Cheyennes. And there was this guy, Joseph Williams, who was a Methodist minister who came out west in 1841. He was an old man at the time, and he wanted to just kind of see the West and preach to the Indians. And so he headed out to Oregon, but he came kind of via the southern route and up through Bent's Fort in southeastern Colorado. And when he was there, he talked about seeing 70 or 80 lodges of Cheyennes, and that a lodge is made of 8 or 9 elk skins. So that's 1841. That's further kind of corroborated by George Bent, who was the son of the Cheyenne woman, Owl Woman, and William Bent, who was the founder of Bent's Fort. And George Bent was born in 1843, so just 2 years after Joseph Williams came through. But George Bent wrote a letter to his biographer, and in the letter, he talked about how when the Cheyennes migrated west, because they were originally up in Minnesota and Great Lakes area, and they migrated in, was it the late 17th or early 18th century? He talks about how when they migrated into the lands of the buffalo and the elk, that elk skins were also used. So again, there's another classic plains tribe. And then if we look at the northern plains in the Blackfeet, John Barrows was family were settlers, and they migrated out into Montana in the early 1880s when he was a young boy. And in his memoir, he talked about time he spent among the Piegan Blackfeet. And he talks about the typical teepee was a conical lodge of elk skin. And so all those are just examples of plains tribes that used the elk skins for their teepees. And so that always brings up the question of like, well, what was the actual range of the elk and buffalo? Where were they? I threw in this photo, which I think is, or this picture of this painting from George Catlin, which is titled "The Elk and the Buffalo Making an Acquaintance in Texas." I think that's kind of a fun painting. But if we go into the range of the buffalo and the elk, and we'll start with the buffalo. There was this treatise on the extermination of the American bison that was published by the Smithsonian in 1887. And this map is in there, and it kind of shows the range over time. And this red outline on this map shows what the range would have been, kind of like first contact with Europeans. And then it shows how it changed over time. So by about 1820, you don't really see any buffalo east of the Mississippi. And then by the 40s, the ones over here in the west are starting to disappear, and the ones in the south are starting to kind of disappear. And then the Transcontinental Railroad comes through in the mid 1860s and forever splits the herd into a northern and a southern herd. The southern herd is essentially killed off by 1877, and the northern herd lasts a little bit longer, but is killed off by 1883. And so that's kind of important to think about as far as, no, there's going to be very few buffalo hunted after those years. They were just kind of scattered here and there, and this map shows little pockets of them. But if we look at the elk range and we look at this map compared to the other ones, the elk range is very, very similar to the buffalo range, and it extends from basically the East Coast to the West Coast. And so again, this map comes from a study on American big game animals by Ernest Thompson Seton in the 1920s. And so the red is kind of the original range, and then this blue is where the range was at the time he wrote it in 1925. People typically think of elk as being a Rocky Mountain animal, but they did cover the plains as well. And one thing I've heard is well, the elk were kind of pushed from the plains into the mountains, and that's actually not true because there was actually six distinct subspecies of elk. And so there is the Rocky Mountain elk that we think of today, but there was the plains elk or the Manitoban elk that were in the plains and up into the northern plains in Manitoba. There was also the eastern elk. The last one of those was killed in 1877. There's two species in the Pacific Northwest and northern Canada or California. And then there was a species in the Southwest, Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. That one is now considered extinct as well, but the other ones are still around. And we're starting to see more and more of them as the plains elk are kind of being reintroduced into states like Kansas and Kentucky. But one of the things Seton also wrote about in his book is he gave some estimates of populations, and he thought that there was probably about 50 million buffalo originally and 10 million elk. So still pretty great numbers of elk. Just to give a perspective, there's approximately 1 million elk today, up from about 60,000 in the early 1900s. And 80% of those are all in the Rocky Mountains. A whole third of those are in Colorado, which is the most elk of any state. So those those are further kind of like proven if you look at old journal references. So many of them talk about the elk being on the plains, and there's tribes, plains tribes, and people are named after elk. But when Maximilian came out west, he brought the artist Carl Bodmer, and Bodmer drew this painting, which I think is pretty cool, and it's called the Elk Pyramid. And he talked about how when they were in eastern Montana, they could see these huge piles of elk antlers that native hunters, when they'd be out hunting, they'd gather up the shed antlers and just throw them in these piles, and you could see these mounds for miles. And again, this is an Alfred Miller painting showing Pawnee Indians hunting elk. And so the main thing just to keep in mind is that elk had such a large range, and not just the Rocky Mountains, but they were also all over the plains. So the next question, and one that I've heard mentioned before, is that elk would have only been used as a substitute after the buffalo were killed off. And so if we kind of dig into that a little bit, um, during the Indian Wars period, which is a tragic period of our country's history, but one thing is that many of those army officers did leave pretty detailed accounts. And so one of them is John Gregory Burke, who was with General Crook. And what they call the Great Sioux War of the mid 1870s. And in his journal, he talks about how the Sioux have teepees of buffalo or elk skin. And then after the Battle of Powder River in March of 1876, which was fought against Crazy Horse in the Minneconjou Sioux and some Northern Cheyenne, he talks about how the men were busy setting fire to the lodges of elk and buffalo hide and canvas. And so the thing to keep in mind is by the time the buffalo were gone, there was already a substitute for buffalo, and that was cloth or canvas. And that goes all the way back to the earliest references I found are in 1848, which is Rudolph Kerr's on the Upper Missouri at Fort Union. And he talks about how the Indians have tents of white cotton cloth, and there's some American Fur Company ledgers that show large amounts of cloth earlier than that, so that's possible earlier, but definitely through the 1850s, you start seeing more and more. When Randolph Marcy wrote his guide for immigrants in 1859, he talks about canvas making a good substitute. And then by the 70s, even the agents for the Sioux tribe were purchasing large amounts. So in 1871, this one had a purchase for 10,000 yards of cotton duck, and then in 1875, the agents requesting more duck because he says the buffalo are gone and you can't expect them to make lodges of buffalo skin anymore. So the point there is just that um, there was already a substitute for hides at that time, and pretty much after 1880, all the teepees being made were made of canvas. But if we dig into some of the earlier references, you can kind of deduce that, elk were being used well before the buffalo were being killed off. And here's a couple, and they go all the way back to Lewis and Clark. When Lewis and Clark came west in 1804, they talked about seeing some Sioux with lodges of white-dressed buffalo and elk skins. So, I mean, at that time, the buffalo were still extremely numerous. And so it's obvious it wasn't just a substitute. And that brings up the big question of why would one be used over the other? And so I like to break that down into these different categories and starting with hunting and getting the hides, and then the hides and the animals, the size of them, and then how you would tan them, and then from that, the weight of the hides and other characteristics. So if you start at the hunting method and obtaining the hides, I mentioned that 50 million buffalo originally and 10 million elk. So both of them are extremely numerous animals. Both of them are large bodied animals, which is what you'd want for making a teepee. But the buffalo did roam in larger herds, and especially after the introduction of the horse, it was a lot easier to run the buffalo and kill large numbers relatively easily. So in that sense, buffalo is probably a little bit easier to obtain. Um, and then one of the things I often hear is like, well, buffalo hides are really big and thick and strong, right? And so I think the typical image people have of buffalo is of these giant herd bulls. And this one is from a friend we have in Lipscomb, Texas. And so if you look at a herd bull like this, he's probably 1,800 pounds or more. But those aren't the type of hides that they're hunting when they're trying to make, you know, clothing or teepees. And that's also shows up in a lot of the old accounts too. And they talk about how the bulls are just too thick to tan. Um, Francis Parkman has an interesting account because he joined up with the Sioux when were out to hunt buffalo to specifically get hides to make new lodges. And he talks about how they've killed enough buffalo bulls, but he says those skins of the bulls are too thick and heavy to make lodges of. And so what they really were tanning were cows. And this is a picture also from our friend's herd. And I've asked very politely for these buffalo to just stand next to each other and so I could have a good comparison picture. And so this little one up front, this one is approximately like a 9-month-old bull. This would have been in January. He would have been born in the spring. So this would have been, his first winter. And then behind him would have been about a 2-year-old cow. And then this is about a 3 or maybe 4-year-old bull, and to give a little bit of perspective. But these cows, like this one in the center, is probably the ideal size for making lodge skins, but also robes. And even the small one, it makes a really nice robe too. But they definitely weren't hunting these really big ones. And so if we look at that, this middle one is about a 600 to 800 pound animal, and the hide would be about 35 to 40 square feet. So if we compare that to elk, the average mature grown cow elk would be about 450 to 650 pounds. So a little bit smaller. And then the hide would be about 25 to 32 square feet. So again, a little bit smaller, but probably not as small as you would think. Here's a picture of me with a couple of the hides I used when I made my lodge. And a bull elk can get up to about 700 to 1100 pounds. So that brings up the idea of tanning. There's kind of two main ways hides were tanned. They're either the wet scrape or the dry scrape method, is what we refer to them today. In wet scrape, you'd take either a freshly skinned hide or take one and soak it in water or a wood ash solution. And then you scrape off the hair with the top layer of skin. And when you do that, you can use a rather dull tool. You could use bone, you could use wood. It doesn't need anything fancy versus the dry scrape method, which is where you'd take the hide and you'd either peg it out on the ground or tie it in a frame and let it dry to a rawhide state, and from there scrape off the hair and top layer. And that requires a sharp tool. And originally it could be flint, which would require, making the flint tools and touching them up and keeping them sharp. Or metal was adopted as quickly as possible and is much more effective. It lasts longer, it's easier to sharpen. When it comes to the buffalo hides, all animals, but especially buffalo hides, they're not this uniform thickness. They're very inconsistent. The whole like sides along the rib cage is actually extremely thin, much thinner than most people would realize. But then like the neck and the spine is really thick, and also the rumps. And so on buffalo, that has to be thinned down. So you can't do it with the wet scrape method. That needs the dry scrape method. Whereas elk are easy to do wet scrape and generally don't need any thinning if you're doing cows. The other thing to think about is the fiber structure. So hides are kind of made up of a bunch of fibers, like a woven fabric, and the fibers in a buffalo are actually very large and loose. And if you're tanning one, it's extremely easy to overwork it to where they just like pull apart. So um, in many ways, they're not as strong of a fiber and hide as a elk or a deer. And then the last thing is when you're tanning them, typically we think of brain tanning and using the animal brain to tan it, and that works just fine on elk. Buffalo generally accounts, and everyone that I know that tans buffalo ends up adding a little bit of extra oil, whether it's tallow or bone marrow grease. And that just kind of helps a little bit to get them to soften because they're tanned in a slightly different way. But the thing to keep in mind is any of those oils that are used add extra weight. And then kind of a little sidebar here. One of the things I found in my research was this 1870s Hidatsa dictionary. And I don't know how to say the word, but there is a specific word that talks about that has a definition of a heavy dressed elk or buffalo skin. I thought that was pretty interesting. Um, but yeah, if we talk a little bit about the summary of the differences, they're both plentiful. Um, Buffalo, you could hunt more effectively, so they're a little easier to come by. Um, Elk, you can wet scrape and you don't need a sharp tool or even a metal tool. You don't have to thin them. You can use just brains. Um, they are a little bit smaller at about 25 to 30 square feet, but the weight is less overall. And so a elk hide is going to be 3.5 pounds usually, compared to the buffalo, which must be dry scraped and you need a sharp tool, either flint or metal, and you have to thin them, and you usually have to add extra oils. They're a little bit bigger, but they tend to weigh a little bit more. And that's important to think about because you use a number of hides, and so every pound is going to be multiplied. And if we think about especially the early days, pre-contact, so even pre-metal or maybe even pre-horse, the weight of those lodges is important because they're going to have to be transported either by people or by dogs. So the lighter the weight, the better. So I typically ask people what they think a hide lodge would weigh, and I usually get answers that are crazy, like 100, 150 pounds. But they're not as heavy as you would think. And the one that I made, it's 14 to 15 feet, used 12 elk, and it only weighs 37 pounds, which is coincidentally the exact same weight as the 14-foot canvas teepee that I have. But also some comparison because I know a few other people that have made these hide lodges, and a friend of mine up in Montana made one out of 12 buffalo, and a little bit bigger than mine, but his weighed 70 pounds. And the main difference there is just that he probably didn't thin the hides as well and probably used a lot of grease, which adds a lot of weight. But I think more reasonable is a friend of mine down in Texas just finished one up about a month ago with 18 buffalo hides and it weighed about 80 pounds. And those kind of line up with some that I have numbers for in museums. The only reference that I've ever come across that talks about weight comes from Onyate in 1599, and he talks about a large lodge, which we don't know what that means, but if we think about all the other references early that talk about sizes, I would guess it's probably about 14 feet, 14, 15 maybe. But he talks about it not weighing over 50 pounds. So these are ones that are modern made. And so if we look at the few that I know of, because there's not a whole lot of lodges that exist in museums, and those that do are really fragile and you can't handle them. But there's this one that's in the Smithsonian, and it's listed as Blackfeet, and it's approximately 12 feet. And the catalog card says it's probably elk and that it weighs 30 pounds. And so that lines up pretty much exactly with the one that I made. Mine's slightly bigger, but it weighs just a few more pounds. And then this one is a great Nez Perce Lodge up in Cody, and it weighs 85 pounds, which is basically the same as the one my friend Jesse made. So the other thing that we have to go off of is historic photos. And so if you were to ask me if I could look at a photo and tell you if it's an elk or buffalo hide lodge, I'd say no, I can't really tell you. If it's elk, I could tell you if it's probably buffalo though, because there's a couple characteristics that we look for. A buffalo's got that hump, and when you tan it, it's hard to get that to come out soft and it doesn't lay flat, so it often shows up as kind of a pucker. And so if you can see on this one here, this is a Ute Lodge. Um, there's this pucker right here on this hide, and then there's the spine, and that often shows up as a darker color on buffalo hides, and it's because the texture of the skin on it's kind of a weird actually. It's sort of like rubbery. It's hard to scrape, it's hard to get soft, and so it kind of shows up as a little bit of a darker line. So those are some characteristics. If you're looking at a photo, you can tell that it's a buffalo hide. So again, this is Ute. We know Utes used elk hide lodges, but this one is definitely buffalo hide. If we look at this other photo of a Ute lodge, which is typically listed with a title of Ute, the elkskin tent, and this was taken by John Hillers, who was with the John Wesley Powell expedition. We can't quite see that hump pocket or spine very much on this one, just because of the quality of the photo. But another thing we can look at is if you zoom in on the door of that, there's a little kid in there, and next to him, there's something hanging down. And so typically when a lodge is made, the butt ends are placed in the front where they come together, where the lacing pins are. And that's just because that's going to be the strongest area where that tension is. And so this right here is a tail. And if you've ever looked at an elk, they don't really have much of a tail. And if you try to tan one, it's kind of weird in that if you cut into it, it's kind of like this black gooey, it's like a scent gland in the tail, and you can't really get that to come out soft. And even if you did, it would just be the little nub versus a buffalo tail, which is rather long, like a foot or more. And so there's a tail hanging down here. If you look at the very back of the lodge, there's also a tail hanging down here. So again, this one is definitely made of buffalo hides. And I think the confusion comes from where people call it the elkskin tent is because the original description actually is called Group of Five near Elkskins Tent, and it's a lodge that belonged to a man named Elkskin. So those are just a couple things to look at. But it always brings up the question of, well, does it have to be all one or the other, or could you ever combine them? And one of the things I've come across is this ledger from Fort Hall, which was a fur trading post in near Pocatello, Idaho. And they have really detailed records. And this entry from December of 1835, they talk about how they got 5 dressed cow skins, which are of buffalo hides, and then 4 dressed elk skins. And then they took those and they had a local native woman or group of native women sew them together. And so this is one of the only definitive references I have showing that you could use both elk and buffalo, but there's really no reason not to. And so it's very possible that that was done frequently. And it's also hard to tell because a lot of the references will say they were teepees made of elk and buffalo. And so you don't know, does that mean they were a combination or just that some were elk, some were buffalo? No real way to know, but definitely something to think about. And then the last thing about hides is that I often get asked if there's any other animals that get used, and deer is usually the one that people ask. And if you think about a large deer, it's only going to be about 12 to 15 square feet, at least for the mule deer in my area. So you'd need at least 2.5 times as many. And so that ends up being a lot more tanning. And then it actually ends up being way more sewing too. So there's not really a good reason to do that if you can get access to buffalo or elk. But moose, on the other hand, they are large animals. Um, and actually, there are references to them being used, at least up in some of the Canadian tribes up there. But the thing to think about on moose is just like the elk range changed over time, so did the moose range. And you don't find records of the moose further than Canada or northern Montana in the old references. But their range has actually expanded, and so we find moose all the way down here into Colorado. They're down into New Mexico, but historically they just weren't. So um, they weren't something that was used. And the same thing for caribou. Um, the question is, were elk kind of second-rate substitute, or did anybody ever have a preference for them? And one of those first mentions references to the Kootenai, they talked about how they preferred elk hide. But if we look at early accounts, we can also find some that show that. So John Work was a Hudson's Bay Company employee, and he led what was called the Snake Country expeditions as fur trappers in the 1830s. And he left an extremely detailed journal, and he would write like the day by day accounts. And so there's one week in February of 1831 where he describes how men went out to hunt elk to kill them for their skins. And then a couple days later, he talks about how more people went out to hunt buffalo and how they brought back some buffalo meat. And then another day, some more people come back with buffalo meat. And then the last day, he says, the people went out to hunt elk principally for the skins to make lodges of. So this is a good example where, they're talking about the elk skins for lodges, but, in that same week, they've been out hunting buffalo. And so to me, that's showing there's a preference there. And as far as who the people are, he always refers to them as the people. Um, that he was with a Hudson's Bay Brigade, which tends to be made up of Canadian and Métis or Eastern Indian tribes. But he's also at the time camped with a group of Shoshone and there's some Nez Perce and Blackfeet in the area. So it's hard to say exactly who he's talking about. So it could have been any of those groups. One other kind of area I went down was looking at what's usually called myths or traditional stories. And there's quite a few of them that I've found. And here's just a couple of them. And so this one was recorded by Robert Lowy in the Myths and Traditions of the Crow. And this is interesting because he basically is saying that they came across a large herd of elk and they ran them over a cliff. So just like we think of buffalo jumps, they were running the elk off the cliff. And then to kind of give a little perspective on priority, he talks about how they went out and they gathered the teeth, but then they only skinned about 20 of the elk. And then later he mentions that those elk hides were used to tan and make into a teepee cover. And then there's a couple others, and these are interesting too because they're also kind of showing the preference for elk. So Edward Curtis recorded this one amongst the Gros Ventre, and he talks about there being a fine elkskin lodge, but then there's buffalo grazing in the background. So again, there's definitely buffalo available, but so why would they be using an elkskin lodge unless there was a preference? Um, and I think also when it comes to preference, like me as a tanner, I've tanned both buffalo and elk, and I just prefer to tan elk. I think they're easier, but I have a friend who would prefer to tan buffalo instead of elk. So I think that probably happened as well. So I feel like at this point I've kind of covered a lot of references and showed there's a lot of people using them and that they were relatively common. So if you keep that in mind, then it's easy to start kind of like reading between the lines because there's a lot of accounts written in old journals that are just very vague and they don't actually distinguish whether lodges were made of buffalo or elk. And it's probably because they either, it just wasn't important detail to them, but maybe they just didn't know. But here's just a couple examples of those. And this first one is about the Utes. And he talks about how the Utes have fine lodges, but then he also says the buffalo had long since left the area. So that's kind of implying that the lodges must be made of elk. And there's others that talk about how, the tribes have leather tents and they're in areas with buffalo and elk, or they have lots of elk skins. But moving on, I mentioned there's not a whole lot of um, hide teepees in museums today, and there's even less of them are elk. I mentioned the one that's this in the Smithsonian, the painted Blackfoot one, but which is this one, and then there's a couple others that are out there. There's this one, which is in the Valley County Pioneer Museum in Glasgow, Montana, which is an Assiniboine lodge, and I think it's made of 26 or 23 elk hides. I haven't seen it in person. I'm pretty sure it was made after the 20th century, and I think the paint job is probably even later than that. Um, there's another one also in Montana at the Nine Pipes Museum that's a Pend Oreille Lodge, and I believe this one was made in 1930. Um, but these are the only pictures of lodges that I've seen that are elkskin lodges, but these are after the 20th century. So if we if we take and use the most advanced technology known to mankind and see what a elk hide lodge of the 19th century would look like, this is what we get. And I think that might give you a little bit of an example, but and also show you how accurate AI is. But that's kind of the end of my talk here. So if we just do a quick summary, um, All hide lodges were made of buffalo skin. That's busted. There's a lot of references to them being used. Um, were elk hide lodges only used in the Rocky Mountains? No, there were plenty of references to plains tribes like the Sioux and the Cheyenne. As far as elk hide being a substitute after buffalo had been killed off, that's also busted because we saw lots of references to elk hide being used well before the buffalo were exterminated. And elk hide wasn't necessarily a second-rate material because there's definitely some accounts that have a preference for it. And I think that elk hide is not necessarily worse than buffalo hide. They are different, but in some ways, elk is maybe a little bit better as far as strength and ease of tanning. So if we take all the references that I've found, these are the 16 tribes that I've been able to definitively um, prove have used elk hide lodges. And if we put those on a map, you can see the range is very, very distributed. And basically, this is all the area that were teepee using people. And so I would say basically anywhere that teepees were used, elk hide teepees were probably also used. As far as in the early days, there may be even more preference for elk due to ease of tanning and the weight. Um, and when you look at some of those traditional stories and myths, those are often passed down for generations. And I think that might also just show of how elk hide teepees were used early on. One last reference comes from Granville Stewart, who was a prominent figure in early Montana history. And he was a gold miner and a rancher and a trader and a politician. And in his memoirs, he wrote about his years ranching and how while they were ranching, they used a lot of lodges and specifically elk hide lodges. And so this is amongst a lot of those Montana tribes, you know, Shoshone, Bannock, Flathead, Kootenai. And the thing that he wrote, which is very telling, is he says in 1858, the most used covering was made from elk skin. Um, and this is a picture that is taken near Helena. And there's some possible conjecture that this could be a picture of Granville Stewart, in which case this could be an elk skin lodge. I don't see any of the typical buffalo traits. So just one interesting thing. So that's all I have about elk skin lodges. If you like this stuff about elk or just hide lodges in general, I wrote a paper earlier this year about the value of hide lodges that goes real deep into like what the trade value was and monetary value in the 1830s. And that was in this Rocky Mountain Fur Trade Journal. This talk will also be published by the Museum of the Mountain Man sometime next year. And so you could look for that. And if there's any other things that you're interested in, let me know. But that's all that I have. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to shout them out or write them in the chat.
Bradley, is there any appreciable difference in how long a bison TP would last versus an elk skin TP?
I don't have a strong answer for you. That's something I kind of hope to be able to experiment with and see with the one that I made. Um, the descriptions that talk about the length that they last are fairly large ranges from like 1 year to 3 is pretty average, but some of them go a little bit longer. I think the environmental conditions, you know, if it's really rainy, really wet, if they're constantly in contact with the wet ground, stuff like that probably affected a lot. So,
But
oh,
there again, there's no decided preference of bison versus elk because
yeah,
bison lasted longer.
nothing that I've seen, no. If I had to take a guess, I would think elk might last a little longer just because of the looser fiber structure of buffalo, I think might start to rip and come apart a little bit quicker. But that's just a guess on my end. Any other questions? I'm surprised Joel doesn't have any questions for me.
You said you had a great talk.
Well,
So I realize this was maybe a little bit different than some of the archaeological stuff, but kind of an interesting take on some material culture that nobody else has ever really dug in, as far as I know.
Bradley, one of the things that strikes me is that the distribution of the lodges you're talking about corresponds pretty well to the distribution of the bison drives, where in Texas, as you probably are aware, we really are firmly have knowledge of two bison drives over cliffs, the jumps,
Mhm.
where you go up to Canada and there's hundreds and hundreds of those things up there. And so there's a real scarcity of those things down here. We get mostly bison arroyo drives down here in
Okay.
Texas. So they shove them up into gullies and slew them in that area. And so, but I'm struck by the decrease of your hides down in the southern plains area.
Yeah,
Is,
and some of that also might be my lacking. I haven't focused enough on some of the southern. I really wish I had some good references to like the Comanche and stuff.
sure.
And I if I had to guess, I would say they probably did, because the Comanche are related to the Shoshonean tribes who definitely used them. You know, the Shoshone and the Utes and the Bannocks, they all used elk hides. And so when the Comanche comes down to Texas in the 18th century, surely they would have brought some of that tradition with them, and the fact that elk were down there in Texas.
And I'm also curious about the hide lining on
Mhm.
these things. It's true that there's an awful lot of plowing that has occurred on the Llano Estacada, and that has really disturbed an awful lot of the
Mhm.
territory. When you look at the archaeological literature, it's really hard to find stone teepee rings in Texas and Oklahoma, I believe,
I
relative to what's going on in New Mexico.
Yeah.
We get a lot of burials in Texas where you can't find burials in New Mexico at all in terms of protohistoric material. So, but a lot of those things, and maybe there's less plowing going on in northeast New Mexico that preserves them a whole lot better when you get off the Llano Estacada in northeast New Mexico. But part of it, you mentioned about the frozen ground as being hard to drive stakes, and I think that's an excellent point you're making. Uh, and but I've also wondered if the rock teepee rings relate to the lining of hides, because if as an interior lining of those things, they don't collect the water that would run off a teepee exterior hide, and which would rot the
Yeah.
hide out
Yeah.
pretty quickly.
Um,
My impression.
And like I mentioned, the linings don't show up too often before 1850. They seem a lot more rare. I think a lot of that also just comes from the fact that kind of just like we are today, the more money we've made and we become richer as a society, we get bigger houses and more stuff. And so over time, as horses were introduced and people became more rich as far as horses, they were able to carry more stuff. And I
Yeah.
think linings start showing up more because of that. Um, but the rocks could be used just to hold down the cover itself. And so I did, before this talk, I did do a quick search, and I wasn't finding much reference to the teepee rings in Texas, and I was curious about that. Um,
Uh, I've been pondering that with Al Skinner for years about
yeah,
that thing.
I usually I'm no archaeologist, so I usually try to stay away from talking about the stone circles and teepee rings because nobody ever wants to agree on what they're for.
Of
So,
course.
but I still think it's pretty interesting to think about.
The last thing I want to mention, this has nothing to do with elk hide,
Uh-huh.
so we'll let you off the hook on this thing, but occasionally you do run across early photographs of villages, particularly in the central northern plains, in which there is uh, uh, a skin lodge that is oval in form.
Yeah.
Uh, that we rarely ever talk about. The oval actually looks
Yeah.
like two half teepees with a bar stretched across the top in those things. And
Yeah, and I leave those out of my talk, but I have a number of references to those sort of types of lodges using elk among like tribes like the Pawnee.
uh-huh.
Um,
Very good job. I really
yeah,
appreciate what you said today.
and there's some other ones that are like the Shoshone and stuff where not the typical teepee with like poles that intersect at the top, but they use like saplings and kind of just bend them over, and they use elk hide